We've just finished a lengthy series in the book of Mark, and we're going to start a new series today in the Old Testament book of Esther. We live in a liminal time, a time of change. The world seems to be changing at an incredible rate. What was no longer is, and what we will be is it's yet to be seen. And it's not any stretch to say that we live in a post-Christian society. But honestly, that tells us more about what we're not than what we are. In that, we see the rise of extremes on both sides, particularly in the political realm. We see extremes just getting larger and larger. People getting angrier and angrier. And while we may long for a different time, we don't get to choose the time that we live. We simply get to choose how we're going to engage in this time. We get to choose how we're going to engage the world or hide from the world. If we're going to engage our spheres of influence for the kingdom of Christ. So if you have a Bible, would you open it to the Old Testament book, Esther? If you've got one of the study Bibles, that'd be page 748, and I'm going to give you a heads up today. There's a lot of info today, so I'm going to kind of information dump on you here today, and there'll just be a bunch of it. Esther's the last of the historical books of the Old Testament, so it starts with the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then it goes into history books. Esther is the last of the history books. It was written 2,500 years ago. For those of you who are familiar with your Old Testament, names like Isaiah, Jeremiah, their ministries happened, and then Daniel writes, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then you have Esther from a timing perspective. Remember, the Jewish people had gone into exile, and now many had gone home. There was a new administration had come in, and they had allowed the Jews to return home, but some had stayed in Persia under the reign of a guy named Xerxes. Now, I put a PG-13 rating on this because I felt obligated to do so. This story is anybody remember there's a VeggieTales version of Esther? Okay, this is less VeggieTales and more Game of Thrones. And some of you that know what Game of Thrones is go, oh, that's awful. Well, it is, and I am not recommending that. I'm just simply saying what the story resembles. Okay? So I won't be crude or overly graphic, but it is important to see the text for what it is. Esther is honestly, it's a story of sex and power plays and ancient feuds and binge drinking and an awful lot of impaling. And every character in the book of Esther is compromised. And yet, behind the scenes, we see a God who's at work and who's good. That's the big picture of Esther. Esther is a very unique book that, honestly, it's going to require me to preach a little differently than what I typically do. There's not natural breaks in the text. There's not one single mention of God in the entire book. There's no mention of the promised land. There's no mention of a covenant. There's no mention of salvation. There's no mention of anything. It's just this story, but it's incredibly important, so it's important that we get into it. And I've had a couple people say, well, why not preach Daniel? It's about the same topic, same time frame, and here's why. Daniel is that all-star that every time he steps up to the plate, he hits a home run. He's here I am, and this is what I'm going to do. And he just knocks it out every time. We get to Esther, and things are a bit more complicated. And the people's lives are a bit more complicated. And honestly, they're a whole lot more broken. And the reality is we resemble more of the folks in Esther who are compromised, trying to figure out how in the world are we going to live for Christ in the middle of this mess. So it's important for us to get into this text. And I'll be asking you to read a little bit each week, and then I'll hit the high points as we go along. We'll touch a couple of scenes from this book each week over the next month as we look at this great Old Testament book. So I'm going to just call this scene 1. Esther 1, start in verse 1. These events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, is how you say that, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress of Susa. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and the officials from the provinces. He displayed his glorious wealth of his kingdom and magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. 180 days. So this is this big party that he puts on where he lets everyone see kind of what he has. And it's you notice it says, some of your translations will say Xerxes and some will say Ahasuerus, same person. The Jews called him Ahasuerus. To a Hebrew reader, it sounds like King Headache. That's what they called him, is, well, we're just going to call him King Headache. History books will know him as Xerxes. And they called him the King of Kings. He was literally considered to be a God king. He was, hands down, the most powerful man on the planet. He ruled everything from Ethiopia to India. The most valuable commodity was FaceTime with him, because what he said was absolute, and he could make or break entire countries with his word. And as this book starts, it recalls this party, this display of his enormous wealth. He's showing off, and he's got a couple of reasons to do that. He shows off his incredible wealth to all his people. It's sort of a way of saying, hey, stick with me. You can have part of this. This is what the good life looks like. Just stay with me. As a matter of fact, history records, even the scriptures here in the following verses say that he had gold and silver, not coins, couches. He sat on solid gold couches. There's a historian by the name of Herodotus that records, this is outside of Scripture, that when they retreated from the war with the Greeks, that he left gold couches just laying all over the place. That's the kind of wealth that he has. And here at this party, nations are coming with tribute of like gold and wagon loads of silver, wine, women for his harem, and eunuchs for his service. And when I say it was wild, this party was wild by any stretch of the imagination. The ancient Jewish writers said that Satan himself danced with them there. That's the kind of picture of what this is. But it's more than just a party. He has all of his military folks there. This is a war council as well. He's raising support to go to war with those pesky Greeks. They'd embarrassed his dad at the Battle of Marathon a few years back, and it was time for them to pay. No one gets to embarrass someone from Xerxes' family, not ever. So he's raising support because he intends to go and wipe out Greece. Hop forward to verse 10. On the 7th day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, Ahasuerus commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. And you go, how do you notice that? I have no idea if I pronounce those right. I just say it real fast and act like I know what I'm doing. These are the 7 eunuchs who personally served him to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. And the king became furious and his anger burned within him. After a week of partying, says the king was feeling good with wine. That's a very kind way of saying this guy's drunk. I mean, really drunk. He's that sort of drunk that makes everyone uncomfortable. Because when he gets like this, bad things can happen. And for some reason, he calls 7 attendants to go and to fetch his wife for him. She refuses. No one refuses Xerxes. Now, before you think that she's just being rude, because I can remember being a kid in Sunday school class and think, well, that's just rude of her to do that. All she had to do, he wanted to show off the crown. Well, there's some historical realities that need to be considered here. Women in Persia were considered to be property. Even the queen is property. She was allowed to see him, her husband, when he wanted. If she showed up unannounced, if he didn't extend his scepter, she died on the spot. That's the way that gals were thought of. She had a special position, but she was kept with the rest of his incredibly large harem at his beck and call. When he wanted to see his wife, he had someone fetch her. That's what's happening here. And it says Vashti is stunning. Xerxes wants to show off his good-looking wife to his drunk buddies. Some of the Jewish commentators suggest that she was going to be required to show up wearing only her crown and be paraded in front of his subjects. It's quite possible. Others suggest it was going to get a whole lot darker than that. And unfortunately, it's quite possible. What we know is that she said, I'm not going to do it. Nope. Not again. He's not going to do that again. And whatever it was that she was being asked to do, she was willing to say no to the point that this may cost her her life, not only her life, but her handmaidens as well, because Xerxes wiped them all out like that. This is a huge deal, and he's furious. I mean, how in the world could he command armies if he can't even govern his own home? And if Vashti can get away with saying no, what's that say to the other gals in the Persian Empire? Oh, this is a problem, and his advisors start chattering about it. This kind of thing can't go unaddressed. She wasn't killed, but she was banished. And they wanted to make a spectacle of this. So they sent letters to every people group in every town, in every language, in every font. Times New Roman, Calibri, Wingdings, whatever you like. Everyone had to get this down, that this sort of stuff is not, it's not going to be tolerated. Not at all. The message is clear. If you resist the status quo, you're put on notice. Dissent is not welcome in the kingdom. Hey, let's stop and step out for just a minute. Let's step out of this story, because frankly, I can't help myself. Our world isn't that much different. The backdrop is different, that's for sure, but the false gods of sex, power, and influence haven't changed at all. And likewise, in a secular society, everything is permissible except that which makes absolutes, which Christianity does. There's no way around that. And I am not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet, but it does appear that the writing is on the wall. Christianity, which resembles Jesus and the apostles, will likely become less welcome. And it's obvious to see how that, right, I don't need to detail this. It's obvious to see how this plays out in society. We have to be wise about what hills we're willing to die on. Perhaps that old mantra, what would Jesus do, would be very appropriate right now. But more scary for me than how Christianity stands out in contrast to society, I believe that Christianity that resembles Jesus and the apostles can also be unwelcome in our churches. See, far too often, go with me for a second, far too often our expression of Christianity, preferences, agendas, traditions, and political affiliations are functionally more important than following Christ. Fair warning to those who resist the status quo. You're put on notice. Dissent is not welcome. He was a professor at Southern Baptist Seminary, a conservative Baptist seminary. Guy's brilliant. Literally brilliant. Great preacher, great thinker. They put him in charge of their Religious Liberties and Ethics Commission. In other words, he was the voice for Washington for all of the Southern Baptists. All of them. And when there was one administration in, he stood up and called out sin. He said, that's wrong. That's not who we are as a people. And everyone cheered him. Everyone cheered him. The next administration came in, and it was from the other side of the aisle. And he stood up and said, that's sin. That's not who we are. And they ran him out of town. We follow Jesus, period. Everything else is subject to that. Following Jesus will require a backbone, period. It takes guts to love and serve and stand up to hypocrisy, maybe more than ever. This is why our seminaries are struggling right now. And if you don't know, our seminaries are struggling in incredible ways because a lot of young men just say, I don't want to do that. There's easier ways to make a living. Period. I was at a conference where like nationally looking at church planting in different parts of the country. And in the past, since COVID, the average age of the church planter that we're sending out right now has gone up a decade. A decade. We're sending out guys that were 35 and now they're 45. It's because the guys who were 35, we can't get them to go. Because of this. Dissent is not welcome. Oh, but we get, lest I get on too much of a soapbox here, we need to get back to Esther. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2, a lot happens. Historically, we know this. Between 1 and 2, Xerxes goes on that great war campaign. So he and all of his people, Herodotus records that he marched with a 2 million man army. Now, I think that's probably exaggerating a bit because typically with history, the victors write the history books. So it's unlikely that it was quite that big, but it was huge. And all was going well for him until he ran into King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. And that was a problem. And he ended up winning that at great cost, but it gave Sparta time to get ready. And then he lost, and he went home defeated and embarrassed. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. Sometime later, when King Ahasuerus' rage had cooled down, he remembered Vashti, what she'd done and what was decided against her. The king's personal attendant suggested, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in each province of his kingdom so that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the supervision of Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so accordingly. Xerxes, the one they called the God King, the King of Kings, he was humiliated by his wife, and then he was humiliated by the Greeks. This isn't good when you claim to be a god, because false gods tend to pout when they don't get their way. And now he's regretting what happened to Vashti. You know, she wasn't that bad. She made some mistakes. So did I. Maybe we should have tried to work this out. But an unhappy Xerxes is a very dangerous man. So again, his crew of advisors, which always have just the best ideas, come up with a plan to round up the best-looking girls. And remember, this guy literally runs from Ethiopia, which down in Africa, if you're not familiar with geography, all the way to India. Think of the scale of this. comes up with a plan to round up all of the best-looking gals who had never been with a man before. Now, if you study this text and you say, hey, I really think this is a beauty pageant, I'll honor that and say, good. I study the text and don't come up with that at all. This is very, very dark. So all of these gals are taken from their homes. They would prep for a year, physically, diet, cosmetics, perfume, whole thing, whole year, for one night with him. She would go in the evening and be picked up in the morning. The sole purpose was to please and impress him, and honestly, that's disgusting. One of these gals was going to end up being married, and the rest would essentially become widows. Here's the thing about Persia. There was a law that it was illegal for a woman who'd been with Xerxes to ever be with another man. Ever. Ever. So he's essentially destroying a generation of young women from Ethiopia to India. And now we're going to meet the main characters of this book. As we get into this, look at verse 5. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judea into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, that is, Esther, because she had no mother or father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. Right now, that's a bad thing. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So here we meet two of the main characters of this book. The problem is, and we'll find this out, they're not exactly hero material. They're just not. Mordecai, here, I'll explain it this way. Before I got into ministry, I remember I was at work one day, and we were calling in our Saturday lunches, and someone said, let's have Shapiro's. Let's have Shapiro's. Send someone downtown, we're going to have Shapiro's, great Jewish deli downtown. And we're like, yeah, that sounds great. And one of my friends goes, man, I had the best ham sandwich there. I want a ham sandwich. And I kind of laughed. I said, you didn't have a ham sandwich at Shapiro's, I can promise you that. Well, yes, I did. No, you didn't. I'm like, dude, you ain't going to have a ham sandwich, a cheeseburger. You're not going to have shrimp. You're not going to have bacon. I can promise you it's a kosher deli. They don't do ham there. We ended up betting. I got my lunch paid for, but that's another story. Okay, so to say that you had a ham sandwich at Shapiro's is like saying there was a Jew named Mordecai. Everyone who read this back then, they read, there was a Jew named Mordecai, and they said, no, there's not. No, there's not, because the name Mordecai honors the Persian god Marduk. It's like meeting a Muslim named Crucifix. Something about it just doesn't make sense. And they're like, no, there's not a Jew named Mordecai. And if you think that's not a big deal, go back and read the middle parts of Nehemiah. When Nehemiah led some of them back home, those who had intermingled, like weren't speaking their native language and kind of intermingled, done things like name their kids Persian names, he drugged the dudes out in the street, yanked out their beards and beat them. I mean, it's all kinds of violent and nasty. This was a huge deal. So to say that there's a Jew named Mordecai is it's odd. He could have left when the others did. The center of Jewish life would be in Jerusalem, where the temple was. That's why they went back. It's the sacrificial system. For him to stay here is to say, no, that's not important to me. And he lives in the citadel of Susa. In other words, he's a government official. So here's a man with a Jewish heritage, but a Persian name, a Persian job, and a Persian address. He's a compromised man, fully assimilated into Persian society. But then there's Esther, his cousin, and again, in VeggieTales, she's portrayed as a lovely green onion. When I describe Esther here, it is not to besmirch her in any way. We don't judge folks outside of it. We're a different part of history. I'm not trying to put her down or anything in any way that. Matter of fact, I think the clearer we see her, the greater her choice will be, right? It will appreciate her more if we see her clearly. Her parents name her Hadassah, which means the myrtle tree. It's a sign of peace. But she goes by Esther, a name that honors the Persian god Ishtar. Honestly, what she goes through, I can't imagine the wounds this gal carried. But here's the deal. As we study this, it's all passive. It happens to her, but once she's in the system, she works it. She works the system and thrives in it, and we'll see she goes far with that. Here's the point, is she is fully assimilated into Persian life as well. One of a more recent commentator on the book of Esther says, she's the Kim Kardashian of the Old Testament. Now, before you write that off quickly, why do so many people watch that show? It's because money and beauty and influence can be intoxicating. And as we will come, we will find that Esther has all of that. Esther and Mordecai are compromised people who are fully assimilated into a secular world. The question isn't are they going to be good enough to be the heroes we need in this book? The question is, will they take the road of vulnerability and trust their lives into the hands of God? Will they trust God with their futures? So we're going to step out. That's enough of the text for today. We've gotten our way up to this far. But let's look for a moment. I don't have a lot of time left, but let's look at the similarities. You see, the backdrop is different, but the allure is the same. Just like Esther and Mordecai, we live in a society that stands in contrast to the God that we follow. Just like Esther and Mordecai, we aren't two-dimensional people that fall neatly into good or bad categories. Life is so much more complicated than that. I mean, mine is, and I assume yours is as well. What we will see in this book is though God isn't mentioned even once, he is there powerfully at work all the time. We'll see that he's good all the time through this. But it begs the question, how do we, as compromised people with mixed motives, live as God's people in a secular world? There's two roads that folks tend to take. And the first one is this, is isolate, hide, pull back, stay away, avoid the world, circle the wagons, and live inside of our bubble. Well, it's an option. It's a safe option. Honestly, I think I would be quite comfortable living off grid. That's just me. Send me to the mountains and I'll see you all in heaven. The problem with that is it doesn't look anything like Jesus. If we're following Jesus, we're following him to people. We're following him to broken people, people that need him. When I look at Paul, when I look at the apostles, I see him heading towards people, not living hidden lives. The other choice is to assimilate, just adopt the world's values and their methods. Esther and Mordecai went right along with the world. No one even knew she was a Jew. Hear me on this. Assimilation is a failure of nerve. Isolation is a failure of heart. Assimilation fails to resist, but isolation fails to love. Scripture offers a third way. When the Jews were taken out of their land into exile, God gave them real simple guidelines. Jeremiah 29, this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I'm deporting from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens. Eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters to men in marriage so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there. Don't decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I've deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, you thrive. Neither assimilate nor isolate. Our task as Christians in a very, forgive me for being blunt, but a jacked up world. Our task is to live with identity and purpose. Don't be like the rest of the world, but don't hide who you are from the rest of the world either. Sounds strangely like Paul when we get to the New Testament. He says, hey, make it your business to live a quiet life. Work with your hands. Earn the respect of outsiders. Or even simpler, when Jesus says, hey, love God, love others too. This is our task. And I can hear somebody saying, well, I don't know what you're talking about because I'm not assimilating. I would argue, the average person in America right now, if we take the total number of hours they spend scrolling social media, it comes up to a little over a month out of their year. 36 days, 24 hours a day. Make no mistake about it, we are assimilating. When we get to the New Testament, we hear Paul talking this idea of being dual citizens, being a citizen here, but also being a citizen of heaven. And the way that their world worked is when Rome came in, they went and they planted people in areas. And they said, here's what we want you to do. We want you to put Roman architecture there so it looks like Rome. We want you to live like you're in Rome. So every little area looked like Rome. You and I are citizens of heaven. If you know Jesus is Lord, our task is to make our little spheres of influence look a little more like our eternal citizenship. That's our task. It's not to hide, it's not to assimilate, it's to affect to wherever we are, to make it look a little more like heaven. What if we as a church, as individuals, make active choices to work as citizens of heaven in our little worlds? What if we sought the good of the world and those around us, prayed for those, just like God said to do? What if we follow Christ into law offices and doctor offices and into the trades and into restaurants and into travel sports and into the schools, wherever our lives take us, wherever our vocations locate us? See, those are things to be stewarded. Your life is something to be stewarded, not simply lived. To be hard workers, to be good neighbors, to love the unchurched folks around us, and still to draw moral boundaries. To teach our kids to do the same, to welcome those who are far from God and yet keep our hearts close to God, to be appalled by injustice and to work to bring things to rights, to realize that there are moral absolutes and to love the people that reject them. What if we made choices as individuals? Because remember, as a church, we'll never do more than what we're willing to do as individuals. If individuals, we chose to steward every aspect of our lives, our family, our friendships, our work, neither assimilated nor isolated. You see, we can't lose our identity in the mess, and we can't lose our mission. When I wrote this, I was like, man, that just sounds like a lot. It feels like a bunch. Hear me on this. It's never more than one choice at a time. It's never more than what's the next right thing to do. How does Paul say? Therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your lives as a spiritual sacrifice, a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship. Don't be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can discern what's good and pleasing, the perfect will of God. That's our prayer as we get into this book, as we get into this great Old Testament book. Boy, it's tough to read some of this stuff. But here's our calling. We're not to assimilate or isolate. We're to live on purpose. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you. Thank you that even in a crazy world, you're good, and you're active, and you're greater than anyone that we would foolishly call king. Help us as we approach life to not to hide from it, but to steward the aspects of our life for you. We trust you. We love you because you first loved us. In Jesus' name, amen.